Hello, and welcome to Speaking of Supply Chain, where we explore trends, current events, and innovations impacting the supply chain and logistics industries. I'm your host, Ellen Wood. Today, we're excited to be joined by Bryan Nielson, Director and FMCG Lead for North America with Miebach Consulting, who will be talking with us about supply chain planning. Hey, Bryan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ellen. Welcome to be here.
So I'm looking forward to our topic today, but first let's take a quick break from supply chain stuff and get to know you a bit more. You've had quite the career in supply chain, over 30 years working with major companies like Kraft Heinz and Mondelez, and frequently in transformational roles. So we'll talk about that later, but first, what's another job that you've got on your supply or on your back that up, Bill, please. What's another unusual job that you've got on your CV history? What else have you done?
Ellen, that's a great question. As far as unusual, I'm not sure if it's unusual, but I'll tell you something that's a very interesting role I had. Very early in my career, I started with Oscar Mayer, so I was kind of in that industry called a meathead, so to speak. And one of the jobs I had early on was a production supervisor for the hot dog manufacturing production line. And so that was very interesting for me because it had a lot of responsibility because you were not only responsible for the raw materials and ingredients and the batching, but also the processing and cooking of it, and then coming out in the finished good. So it was a full end-to-end production supervisor role, and I really enjoyed it. And I tell you, an interesting fact is what I didn't know was how the skin on the hot dog was made, and really what it is it goes through a smoker, and that smoke creates the skin on the hot dog. And so I thought that was very interesting. And it's my favorite, Alan. My favorite hot dog really is the pure beef hot dog. Those are the best. They really are, and they're really good. So that's what I would tell you. It was a very interesting role. I still remember to this day like it was yesterday.
I don't know. I might have to disagree with you there on the hot dogs. And the reason I say that is my father was also in food production and he worked for Foster Farms Chicken and made their line of corn dogs in Alabama. And he would bring, you're right about the best hot dogs are right off the line. You are absolutely correct. But he would bring home, any of their test products. We had corn dogs whenever we wanted them. But they were really the best right off the line if you could cook them all the way and have them right before they were frozen and packaged and then reheated. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's really interesting and funny that it's food production is so pervasive.
yeah. So the interesting piece is, so when you say frozen, so in the process of hot dogs, a little more detail. A little interesting fact is they have to go through a brine zone, which is just adding salt to water to get it lower than freezing temperature, and it freezes the hot dogs. But if you cut the hot dog out before it goes to the brine zone, best flavor, best hot dog ever. To your point, so totally agree with you. And it was a fun job. It was a great job, and it was a great learning. So when you talk about pure beef, it's really like when you go to a grocery store. If you buy 50 beef, that's really what the hot dog is 50 beef. So it's healthy, it's good for you, and it tastes good. And I got one question
I
for
like all
you.
hot dogs.
I got one
Okay.
question for you, Ellen. Do you put ketchup on your hot dog or just mustard?
I do. I do like ketchup on my hot dogs, but I like onions and mustard and hot peppers. I
Okay.
will dress a hot dog with plain ketchup for my kids and I'll eat it if that's what we're having. But, a chili cheese hot dog is also really good.
Perfect. Awesome.
And when I'm feeling fancy, some sauerkraut and some onions and horseradish mustard, anything on top of a hot dog is delicious, in my opinion. All right. So back to our actual topic, which is supply chain planning. And obviously, events in the past few years have wreaked havoc on the supply chain and especially planning techniques because you can't plan for a pandemic. I don't care how robust plans were prior to March of 2020, they had no idea that this was coming and they had no way to prepare for it. So, what things have changed in the past couple years in regard to the way companies approach their planning strategy?
Ellen, great question. I think let's start out with, the breaking it apart between people, process, and tools from a planning perspective. Okay, and I think if you start with, if you step back from it, and I think what the pandemic did or enable was an output of it was really I would say first is a general awareness of supply chain. For example, I mean, people, they weren't aware of what supply chain is. 35 years ago when I started, supply chain, what is that? Today, people know that, that there's cargo issues at the ports, potential rail strike, driver shortage. I mean, the baby formula shortages, and the new cars with the availability of chips. Everyone understands the supply chain today, at least in general terms. So I think that's a very interesting, just a more awareness of supply chain and the value supply chain brings. So you can tell I get a little excited about it, that we kind of have a seat at the table, the adult table, so to speak, right, from supply chain point of view. And I say that jokingly, but I think how does that translate into business in the boardroom? I think that the C-suites, they kind of look at supply chain, and how they discuss it today is all about supply chain resiliency and reliability, and what are those strategies for risk mitigation. So I think that from an organizational perspective and people perspective, those are the topics, and this is how they look at it. And I think what's changed from that perspective. I think there's more of an integrated structure and approach and discussion. There's less around throwing it over the fence, so to speak, into a different function. There's more de-siloing of the supply chain from end to end, I think, is what is an output of this as well. I mean, there was a migration path of de-siloing with the ERP system, but I think this actually made it even accelerate even further, mature for a lot of companies as well that were probably earlier in the mature process for de-siloing. So it really helped, I think, people understand the supply chain. In what are the handoffs in the supply chain between different functions, and how do you bring that all together, going forward? So to me, that from an organizational perspective, people perspective, that was a positive thing coming out of it. And then one of the other things, and jump in anytime, Ellen, if I talk too much, because I can keep going, but there's this. The other, it's always a 10-year cycle or so, 15 years. The interface between each of the functions and who has decision rights, and is it centralized versus decentralized decision making, from the field to corporate. And so that conversation continually goes back and forth, what makes sense or not. So that's probably a whole topic in itself, centralization versus decentralization within a corporation, and planning and how that works, and who's in best line of sight with the information that you have to make the best decision.
That's true. Yeah. And breaking down those silos and those walls really facilitate conversation throughout the C-suite, as you were saying, to make sure that different groups know what their different objectives are, what their different plans are, what their different goals are in terms of moving the business forward. And having that open communication, like you said, breaking all of that down certainly does make it easier for each of those groups to plan accordingly with the other groups in mind. But is it even still a good practice to spend the amount of time looking at the longer planning horizons? Is that still something that they're doing? Or is the resurgence of COVID, at the end of the year and cold and flu season, are these types of things still knocking people off balance in terms of what they had originally planned for and what's happening in reality?
No, that's a real good question, because if you simplify it and say, well, we need to shorten our planning horizon because of all this disruption, it's actually that's the natural reaction. But intuitively, you want to be able to actually plan. You have to plan longer with these disruptions. You have to plan further out, 6, 9, 12 months out, because of the availability of the materials, the ingredients or packaging, in order to have that committed to your business. So it's what ends up happening is you have to plan for the future further out with these volatility, but then the challenge is to execute in the short horizon, and it's all about execution and the handoffs, and the integration, the execution in the short term. And what this disruption did as far as planning horizon in the short term is you had to create this environment where you're very flexible. So if the delivery was a day late or 2 days late or a week late, you had to run something else to obviously ensure that you were producing product and not underutilizing your capacity on your lines and your people. And so you had to be very flexible in that. And so part of being that flexible is what we see is you have to simplify your supply chain, because the two biggest challenges I think in planning were labor shortages, to your point, and then second is obviously was the material or product available to convert it into a finished product. And so from that perspective, the planning horizon was extended out, but the execution became more of a focus on the day-to-day, week-to-week going forward. And let me just step back. I think from your earlier question around what were some of the processes or approaches from a planning perspective, I think if you look at it, what's changed a little bit, in the planning process, in a longer horizon would be, I would tell you is the sourcing, and there's a couple different sourcing. I think from a supplier perspective, how do you reduce the risk to a supplier of delivering the product that you need when you need it with the amount you need and the specification requirements. And I think so there's this need for expanding your sourcing capability instead of having maybe one or two, having a tertiary supplier that can meet the specifications, and maybe bringing that supplier closer to your manufacturing conversion point is what we see in the trends a little bit versus having it the supplier sourced to the Asian Pacific market and coming to North America, is just trying to have more of a nearshore supplier that can provide that to the conversion within North America. And then I think on the other element, which is a little more complex, is the production facilities, how they plan the production facilities. Can you source those facilities, nearshore, which is closer to the North American demand, which becomes, much more challenging because of the infrastructure requirement and the asset resources with a production facility, and how do you just can't move that overnight. So I think those are some of the things we see from a planning perspective that have changed or are migrating towards how do we nearshore and how do we bring that production closer to the customer, and so there's more of a regionalization per se of how you look at your planning going forward. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Now, is this specific to the FMCG industry, or is this, across multiple industries? Because I know with FMCG, obviously you want to be close to where your clients are, so that or your customers are, so that you can, have that e-commerce and have that flexibility in terms of where you're producing and storing everything. But does this apply to automotive or manufacturing or pharmaceutical? Does it apply?
Yeah. So if you think about it, in the vertical of CPG, fast moving consumer goods, the cycle time in the automobile industry, that they are many times their supply chain model is just in time for the auto industry. So yes, you have to have that supply network or supplier village, so to speak, that's their model, close to the manufacturing facility, because the expense of shutting down a line in the automobile industry is into the seven figures. So it's you have to have that design where that you have that regional and local supplier base. And I think in the FMCG and the CPG is in the same camp, where they're migrating towards having some of those supplier villages and having that supplier closer to the manufacturing conversion location. And I think the other piece of that also is, who owns the inventory. And so if you think about it with, product availability issues, the inventory levels and safety stocks and cycle stocks have gone down due to COVID. And so you have less inventory. And so you have to rely on that replenishment and rely on the reliability of the supplier to deliver when they said they're going to deliver.
So is there a certain aspect of the planning? We've got demand planning, resources, production. Has it shifted in importance as to which is more important than another? Or is that similar to what it was prior to COVID? Because we're talking about, having that sourcing in place and making sure, depending on the industry, whether it's just in time or having enough on hand for 6 months, depending on what you should do. Is that different than the actual production planning now, or has that shifted, traded places?
You're asking some very challenging questions. I think. Thank you for that. I think it depends on who the client or customer is who you're asking. So if you're talking to a production planner, it's going to be more of the scheduling. If you're talking to a C-suite person, I think it's going to be more about the S&OP process, sales and operation planning. Because I think, so it depends on who you're asking the question to, quite frankly. And I think, if you talk to the C-suite, S&OP becomes much more of a topic and more important emphasis today, because the S&OP, obviously addresses the strategic, the budgetary process, and also the operation, and then actually the execution. It touches across the entire supply chain S&OP. And in SOP, sometimes I think it's a bad name, and they think it's a supply chain, process, but it really is a business process across the entire business. How I view S&OP is really a simplification of your overall decision making, and that's really what S&OP allows you to do. And I think one of the things that you see in S&OP today is that it really is taking the right decisions, but also making sure they get executed. And I think that we're making sure it gets executed is where I think a lot of companies fall short. They have these great plans in S&OP, but then as far as how they execute them, they fall short. And it's whether it's the structure, it's whether it's the tools or the process or the people. It's a litany of different challenges that they have. But I think that's I think some of the challenges that I see over the years as far as S&OP and the execution piece of that S&OP and operationalizing, so to speak.
So with some of those challenges, you listed people, you listed processes. Where do you think that companies can focus in order to make the biggest quick improvements, the quick wins?
That's a real good question on planning, because planning, is a lot about the tools and the information. And I would probably say at this stage, I wouldn't have said this 5 years ago, but I'd say today is, some of the tools in digitalization today, in the intersection between digitalization and planning, it's a really big enabler for planning to have this digitalization and leverage machine learning for complex problems. Whether it's even just forecasting and predictions going forward and understanding root cause problems. I think digitalization and computer learning is gone to the next level in the last couple of years, and that can really help drive improvement in planning and forecasting. So I think having some of that digitalization understanding and what the impact is today, I think is probably top of mind from my perspective. And I think the other element of that is probably simulation. We do a lot of simulation within Miebach, and you can simulate the operational bottlenecks and do alternative planning and scheduling and do what if scenarios. And so I think that's pretty. How would I say it? It's a robust tool that gives you a lot of capability to mitigate risk without having to invest in assets or learning from after the fact. So it's something I think today in my recommendation, is something a lot of companies should invest in going forward.
And it's funny that you mentioned you wouldn't have said this 5 years ago, because I've only been in this industry for almost 8 years, but I can agree. In fact, not even 5 years ago, a lot of companies were still doing all of their planning and collecting all of their data in Excel spreadsheets. And then they just have to, run a formula or have an analyst looking through all of the data and trying to uncover those key insights into what they could be doing or what they should be doing. And now all of that can be done through some of these transformational digital tools, this technology that allows the data to be, compiled and modified and just pulled together and then spits out results that then, obviously a human has to make the decision on whether or not to move forward with these recommendations that the data indicates should be done. But are you seeing more companies leaning heavier on that technology? Are more companies adopting technology that allows these things, or are there's still holdouts that are tied to their Excel sheets?
So full disclosure, we have clients today that are still using Excel spreadsheet. Excel, is very predominantly in the CPG industry, and a lot of companies as a supporting tool. You'll have a ERP system, but a lot of data is offset into Excel spreadsheets today. And I think
Excel's a powerful tool. Let's not denigrate it.
No.
But
that means it's a supplemental tool. But the challenge with it is it's the integration of data. And you have data lakes and data warehouses, but how do you integrate? What's that integration point where you can take that data in real time and then share that with other processes to really understand the behavior and predict it in advance versus trying to manually look at the data. So I think there's an opportunity with the data lakes and warehousing and that level of data that you can really integrate today into your decision-making process. So and improve your accuracy, going forward. So I would definitely, recommend, people look at the opportunity and the technology that they have today, and it's just growing. It's just the technology is growing by leaps and bounds. So definitely, if you haven't had a chance to look at, digitalization in the areas, definitely give Miebach a call because we could definitely help you out.
So when it comes to planning, having that technology available and at your disposal certainly does make the planning easier. It makes it faster, and it makes companies able to adapt and correct changes or react to changes in their own organization and pivot, make different decisions, and just react better. Is that what I'm
Yeah,
hearing?
yeah, that you're absolutely right. And I think that, the standard, SAP modules for planning is great, where they're at today. But it's all the other information and inputs from manufacturing or from transportation that may not be incorporated into the planning modules. And I think what ends up happening with digitalization, you're able to take those inputs and then have an overall best solution and understand the trade-offs altogether. So because you end up being myopic in your decision making and planning today, because you're not considering the transportation or it may be something in procurement with a supplier that's not included in the planning inputs. So I think having the ability to take all those inputs from different processes and integrate them into the planning process through digitalization is where we need to go in the future.
So just like we were talking earlier about breaking down those silos and those communication barriers when it comes to the different business units within a company, it's also with the data, breaking down those silos and making sure that all the data is accessible and it can be utilized to find these issues within the data to make actionable decisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have data driven and where you're reducing your time responsiveness versus waiting to a download a week later, a day later. It's more instantaneously when you can integrate the data inputs. So absolutely.
Fantastic. All right. So what else, if you could give one piece of advice to our listeners out there in regard to their supply chain planning that they're doing for 2023, what would you advise them?
Another great question. I mean, there's probably three that come to my mind, but as far as the top, to advise is really
I mean,
looking
you
at
can
your.
give three if you've got three.
I think we've run out of time, but I would my recommendation is really look at your S&OP process and understand is it working, and if not, I think in order to be successful in the future, you really need to have a strong S&OP process within your company and at the C-suite level. And if you're not, you're definitely missing opportunity and not improving your revenue and your EBITDA.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much, Bryan, for joining us and talking about planning because, at the end of the year and at the beginning of the year, that's when everybody is trying to execute this plan that they've come up with for the new year. And hopefully all of our listeners have a great plan in place. And if not, they know who the expert is, who they should come talk to. I hope our listeners enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. We are excited for 2023 and looking forward to many more episodes of Speaking of Supply Chain this year. If anyone out there has a suggestion for a topic or would like to be a guest on our show, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact me at podcast@Miebach at any time. As always, thank you for listening to Speaking of Supply Chain. If you enjoyed our show, please rate it in whatever podcast platform you prefer. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google, or Spotify. And be sure to tune in next time. Thanks.